Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for coming to our panel discussion with Scott Shields and Matt Gonzalez on the lives and art of William Theophilus Brown and Paul Wonner. I want to thank both gentlemen for joining us today. And by way of brief introductions, Scott A. Shields is the Associate Director and Chief Curator of the Crocker Art Museum in Sacramento. He received his Ph.D. from the University of Kansas in 2004 with an emphasis in American painting from 1825 to 1940. He has over 25 years of museum experience in the Midwest and California, and having curated more than 50 exhibitions, he's also the primary and sole author of numerous exhibition catalogues, including the one called Breaking the Rules, Paul Wonner and Theophilus Brown, their retrospective. Matt Gonzalez is an American politician, lawyer, activist.
Former. Please start up.
Who knows, maybe. Activist and artist. He received his BA at Columbia University and his JD from Stanford Law School. After a decade working as a public defender, Gonzalez served a term on San Francisco's 11-member Board of Supervisors. He thereafter co-founded a civil rights law firm, Gonzalez and Lee, LLP, which was active from 2005 to 12 and was Ralph Nader's running mate in the 2008 election on an independent ticket.
Some of that is true.
In 2006, he founded the San Francisco Collage Collective with Robin Saviner and Albert Herter, excuse me. Yeah. The goal of the collective is to democratize art by inviting anyone to participate regardless of previous training. Gonzalez, while working on the collective, other artists participated, including Gustavo Ramos Rivera, Theophilus Brown, and Glenna Putt. And he's an exhibiting artist and has done so since 2006 in the Bay Area. To start things off, I thought we might just do a kind of a brief introduction using the slide deck, but I love this quote, and I thank Scott for lending us a slide deck that he had put together. So, what unites the Bay Area painters is a sense of the odd, the quirky, and the individual. The Californians are the libertarians of the art world. No one is going to tell them how to paint, and their work shows a delightfully pugnacious spirit of rule breaking. That's a quote from Stephen Litt from the News and Observer, the Raleigh Times in 1988. And I thought that quite encapsulated these two artists very well. So Paul Wonner was born in 1920 in Tucson, Arizona, and graduated from high school in 1937. He then went on to the California College of Arts and Crafts, where he graduated with his bachelor's in 1941. World War II took a few years away, but he was stationed in San Antonio as a member of the U.S. Army. And then after the war, he went to New York City and worked as a package designer. And while there, he studied at the Art Students League and the subject of the Artist School, later known as Studio 35. And then in 1950, he enrolls at UC Berkeley, where he gets his second BA in art, because apparently the one at California College of Arts and Crafts wasn't quite good enough for them. He then later went on to get his master's in 1953 from Cal Berkeley as well. And in 1956 has his first one-person exhibition at the DeYoung Museum in San Francisco, which is an amazing feat for somebody who just got 3 years out from grad school. And that same year, he also got his Master of Library Science. So he was quite the bookworm, I would say. So, turning to William Theophilus Brown, he was born in 1919 in Moline, Illinois, and went to high school at Moline High, was that a public school, Scott? Or yeah, so it was a public school. And then later went to the Lake Forest Academy, where he graduated in 1937.
Not public.
Not public. And in 1941, he got his Bachelor of Arts from Yale University in music, so he wasn't initially an artist, though he did have an aptitude for art from very young.
He thought he was going to take art, but he was very unimpressed with the art program at Yale and switched to the music program.
He too served in the army, but actually went to Europe and actually was a part of the Battle of the Bulge, if I remember correctly. And then after the war, he also goes to New York to become a painter, and enrolls in the Amédée. I'm not sure if Amédée. Ozenfant's School of Fine Arts in New York, and then also goes to Europe a couple of times and studies in the atelier of Ferdinand Leger. In 1950, he returns to New York and in 52 comes out and starts graduate studies at Cal Berkeley. In 54 got his MFA. So with that brief beginning, I thought I would kind of start with asking, it's like, they of you two, Wonner and Brown both come from very different backgrounds. How do you two feel like that kind of impacted their work and their trajectory of their careers?
You want me to go first?
Sure.
Well, Wonner grew up poor in Arizona. His mother, he described her as a paranoid schizophrenic. And so it wasn't an easy childhood. She would like kick the kids out of the house and say, don't come back. I don't want you here anymore. So it was a really tough upbringing, but he was very humble, and everybody, and some of you probably knew Paul, was like the most humble human being you could ever hope to meet. Bill was something else again. He was, Yale trained. His parents were wealthy. They had servants that lived in their house. His father had more than 100 patents at John Deere. He was very high up in the John Deere company. And when they first met each other, which was in grad school, they were in 2 classes together their first semester, Paul wouldn't talk to Bill because Paul thought Bill was a snob. And it took like a few months to sort of break the ice for them to get together, and Paul invited him over to lunch. But I think that you see that in their work. Some critics have called Paul's work as having an innate modesty, which I think is true about what he did. And his personality was very much like that. And Bill was very gregarious and loved, and he was amazing for meeting, like, anybody that met him fell in love with him. And the people that met him were really big deals. Like, I remember the first time I went to his house, he had a piece of sheet music, all hand done, and it says, "To Bill from Sam." And I said, "Oh, who is Sam?" He goes, "Sam Barber." Like Adagio for strings, Sam Barber? He goes, "Yeah, Sam." And that's just one. I was like, he knew Picasso, he studied with Leger, he drew with Giacometti. It's just amazing personality.
Yeah, I'll just add, I mean, I think Bill was just very aware that he was from the aristocracy, but he liked to joke around, and he would laugh when he would refer to himself as a remittance man, because, he meets Diebenkorn in 1954. He's 35 years old. He still hasn't done anything to make a living, and his father has tolerated this.
Yeah.
And, sent him money and kept him going. And obviously he's very appreciative of that, but he's also very aware of that privilege. I think, though, that despite the different kinds of upbringing that they had, that the big equalizer for them is the GI Bill. And it was for many of the artists that we know that were at the, SFAI, because, it was a national program to try to do something that hadn't been done in World War I, which was do something for veterans. And, prior to that legislation passing, they had really spoken to veterans coming out of the war, these young soldiers, about what they wanted. Most of them wanted some kind of training, vocational training of some kind. But some of them just wanted to get an education. And a couple of million soldiers took advantage of that opportunity. And while it didn't provide everything when you went to school, it wasn't like everything was paid for, it meant that most of these artists could patch it together, with some teaching and some work. And again, Bill had his father that he could rely on, so he wasn't like in a category, let's say James Weeks, where he's, a sign painter, or others like Bischoff, who had, real jobs at the same time they were building their careers.
So while they both lived in New York after the war, Brown seems to have had quite a bit more development as an artist, say, there than maybe Wonner did, and certainly made a lot more friends. Can you two talk about that a bit and kind of the impact that had on the beginnings of their careers?
Yeah, I don't know if I would agree with that.
Really?
I mean, Paul was in New York for nearly 5 years. I mean, it was over 4 years. And he was studying, as your slide indicated, at the Art Students League, and it was called the
Subjects of the Artist School, which
Subjects
is funny
of the
because they
Artist
had no
School.
subjects. It was all abstract expressionism.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
I mean, Motherwell is teaching,
Yeah.
and he's hearing lectures from
Yeah.
everybody, from de Kooning and
Right.
and all of the Ad Reinhardt and that whole crew.
This is a school that's hardly ever been written about. It only existed for like about 2 years, and then it was gone.
Yeah, and so I think the main difference is that Bill was a really good storyteller and knew many of these artists from social engagements, whereas Paul knew them from this kind of effort at getting an education. I mean, I could be wrong, but my sense is that Paul was well on his way to being an artist. I think maybe before Bill. I mean, Bill was already painting and doing good things, but his work was almost more, and Scott, correct me, but I get the sense it was almost like a modernist cubism, kind of like cubism light,
Yeah.
whereas Paul was really in that kind of, exploration of abstract expressionism,
I think Bill would agree with that, because when he first met Paul in grad school, he said he painted better than most of the faculty. And Bill came in, and he really didn't have that much training. He had informal trainings, art schools in Paris, but very short, because he was very seldom impressed by his teachers.
yeah.
Almost never.
So these are a couple of Bill's pieces.
Yeah.
From the
But
40s.
what did happen to Bill in New York was that he met the de Koonings, and Willem de Kooning was certainly very influential, and he's kind of literally sat at de Kooning's knee and watched him paint the big women paintings. But then what was really more revolutionary for me was that Elaine de Kooning was equally influential. And if you look at Bill Brown starts to do football paintings, Elaine de Kooning had been doing basketball and baseball paintings. And so I think that he was gaining subject matter from her, but compositions from Willem, and putting those two things together. And he really was close to them, because Willem became a good enough friend that he gave Bill one of a painting very much like this one. And Bill carried it around for a long time and used it as a source of inspiration and influence. And then once they wanted to go on a vacation, and they sold it. But there's also another good friend of Bill's was Thomas Hess, who was the editor of Art News. And this might be Thomas Hess's painting that he later became part of the Met's collection. So there was a lot of de Kooning influence going on.
That's the one.
Can I just finish that story? Bill said that, they sold the painting so that they could take a trip to Europe. And on the trip, they ran into de Kooning.
That's right.
And he told them how they were paying for their trip. And Bill got a real kick out of that. He really enjoyed it. I'll just add that this painting on the bottom, Bill told me, I never saw the picture that he referred to, but this painting was exhibited in Moline as I think he was traveling from the East Coast to the West Coast. He stopped and put it in a little show in his hometown, and he told me that there is a photograph in the local newspaper of his parents standing with that painting in the exhibition. Yeah.
Do you want to elaborate kind of the importance of those football paintings to like the development of Brown a little bit? Because we have a couple more slides.
Yeah.
This is one of the first ones after he comes to the.
Yeah, so the football paintings really, as I said, kind of grew out of his relationship with the de Koonings, but in his own way. He didn't care about football. He didn't like it at all. he sometimes he put the wrong color jersey on the wrong team. And but what he liked was this sort of crush of bodies and activity, which put him a little bit outside of what most of the Bay Area figurative artists did, who were mostly doing monumental, very still sort of figures. And he liked the motion and the activity. And you're seeing here what's almost a purely abstract painting that's coming from football. And he was looking at the New York Times, he was looking at magazines, and he's pulling newspaper photographs out and using them.
Can I just say on that last slide, I mean, if I didn't know that football was the subject matter, you know, this is really like an American abstract artist painting.
And it looks like a Diebenkorn, but they hadn't met yet.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah, very much.
Yeah.
And this is where they kind of get to.
Yeah, and so this is a quintessential one. It's a beautiful example. And you can really see the football in there. And then, so when he had his studio on Shattuck Avenue in Berkeley, which was the famous studio that Diebenkorn came to have a studio in, Bischoff had a studio in, and he and Paul had a studio in. There was a woman from Life magazine visiting Diebenkorn, and Diebenkorn wanted to get rid of her because he was tired of dealing with her, sent her over to Bill, and she fell in love with the football paintings, and so ran an article, and that's how he got his first dealer, Felix Landau, and it was really important for his career. And then Landau took on Paul's work too, because of that. We saw them in Life magazine.
Yeah. So Wonner really is an abstract painter in a very abstract expressionist sense at when he arrives at Berkeley, or very soon afterwards. Yeah. And so talk about that and how, because this is one of the early ones that he did, which is now, but this was inspired by, I believe, was that?
I don't know who inspired whom, really.
Okay.
That was one of his teachers. Kyle Morris had become a new professor at Berkeley. Mm-hmm. And clearly the two of them were in some sort of cahoots, because it's hard to look at those. This painting is not black and white, by the way, but it is owned by the Guggenheim. They were both in a Guggenheim show, both of these paintings. But the Guggenheim couldn't be bothered to go give me a good photograph of that. So, did I say that out loud?
Well, they don't even admit to having it on in their website.
And so they own both of those. And the other thing that was in the same show with those was a de Kooning. And so soon what's going to happen is that de Kooning is going to start to factor into Paul's work as well, which is with the ephemeral Coke paintings, which
those are coming up next.
But
this is another one that he did. That's kind of very abstract, but you're starting to see the hints of like a landscape come in.
And his professors, even at Berkeley, which was similar to the California School of Fine Arts, they did not allow any sort of representational anything. So if you were painting like that, you were asked to leave. And so he starts to go out and he says, I wanted to look at things around me and things that meant things to me and start painting them. And I may have been the only one that knew this was Mount Tamalpais in my painting, but or the ocean is in this case. But they gave him his degree anyway. But he said they thought I was crazy, which at that time you probably thought you were crazy, because this is very early in the Bay Area figurative movement.
Yeah. So,
really
and then we get into kind of and here's the shot of Bill, Paul, and Richard Diebenkorn together in the studio I don't know whose studio is that. Diebenkorn studio, or
I don't know if we know.
Oh no, it is. It says a Diebenkorn studio.
Okay.
So, but they all had studios in that same building on Shattuck Avenue.
And Bill and Paul had the biggest one because they were both in there. So most of the drawing group sessions happened in their studio.
Yeah. There's a very funny story of Diebenkorn showing up one day, banging on the door of the studio, and who was it that opened? Was it Bill or Paul?
Paul, I think, and he says, "You have any heat in this goddamn place? I'm freezing my butt off."
Yeah.
It was cheap because there was no heat. That's why. But And then Paul starts moving into these here's a kind of an abstract comparison to Diebenkorn. There's some real influence there.
But we don't know which way it's going.
That's true.
and
I think it could be both ways.
Yeah,
honestly.
I think it was. And one of the things that was really important to me in doing this project was that in the big Bay Area figurative book, they break the group down into first generation, bridge generation, and then everybody else. And the curator at that show didn't really mean to cause harm by putting Bill and Paul in the bridge generation. The problem was they weren't bridge generation, they were first generation. But she was just trying to separate people stylistically a little bit. But what happened was right after the 1989 show, all the newspapers started to write first generation and the followers. And so Bill and Paul were really upset that they were called bridge generation, because even at the time they knew what that was going to mean for them. And it's carried through up until now. And they were really, and what's interesting, and I can prove, is that Paul Wonner became figurative before Diebenkorn became figurative.
He did.
And Bill Brown was figurative even before Elmer Bischoff was. The first one was David Park, no question, but it really is a much different story when you look at it in those terms.
I'll just add, I mean, the narrative that you typically hear is that, David Park started painting in the late 40s, 49, I think, in 1950 with this kind of figurative work. And eventually the others follow that. But one thing I thought, and you've referenced that Guggenheim show where Paul would have seen de Kooning's work in it. It gave me a real appreciation that it was less deciding that David Park got it right and following him, and really more that they saw de Kooning was doing it as well and really being influenced by that.
I think there should be a show about de Kooning and his influence on California, because it's huge. And really, we talk about Bay Area figuration, but de Kooning was a Bay Area figurative painter, except he was on the wrong side of the country, because he had turned to the figure. And that was really important to Diebenkorn too. Diebenkorn didn't know de Kooning, but he was looking at his work in magazines. And he says, I was so shocked to see what de Kooning was doing, and it put a new light on what David Park was doing. Because he just thought Park had gone nuts, I think. And then when de
a lot of
Kooning
people
did it,
thought he had gone nuts.
Can I ask you, with de Kooning, is he doing those women paintings contemporaneous with the abstraction then?
Sometimes yes, but they follow that series of gray interlocking paintings, like the one we just looked at. And then he starts the series of women, and that's what Bill watched get painted, and it's what Paul was in a show with and saw. And there's a catalog that has Paul Wonner's work in it, just a few pages away from a de Kooning woman painting. Perfect segue.
Yes, exactly.
Go, Greg.
So we have next up in the slide deck, we have the Femme au Coq series. So, and you happen to live with one of these from time to time.
I owe a debt to Scott for his research on these, but I had come to own one of the paintings that had, it was titled Femme au Coq, but on the back it had a number on it. It was a number 2 or a number 3. And then later I saw another one, I think the painting at the Crocker, and it had a number attached to it as well. And it made me wonder, well, how many of these paintings are there? And why would, Paul Wonner want to revisit this kind of theme over and over again? And, it was, you see the Picasso woman with rooster there from the 1930s, and it was a theme that Chagall, a trope that he played with as well. And ultimately, Scott shared with me that the Young show that Paul was in actually has, I think, 8 different paintings listed with this theme. And going back to what we said earlier about his studies with Motherwell, Motherwell is known to have been very interested in the Wallace Stevens poem, 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, and would read that to his students and use it as an exercise to get everybody to think about revisiting a subject matter more than once and trying to really do it differently and get more out of it. And we know also that David Park, used it with his students, and we know that Diebenkorn did as well. And Wonner has spoken about not really referencing these paintings from the 50s, but referencing kind of the later still life painting he did as often wanting to revisit a scene and maybe just changing the placement of an object slightly. In fact, I own a painting that I saw an image of online. It's a painting I know very well, and yet it took me a long time before I realized the image I was looking at was a different painting, just slightly changed. But these paintings were done in 1955 and 1956. They have that kind of Guernica-like figure, Picasso influence. But, and Scott really points this out in the Breaking the Rules book, it's really more of a nod to de Kooning. And,
taking a Picasso subject, mixing it with the Kooning brushwork and creating his own sort of thing. But you see the woman with her rooster up there. The rooster's laying in her lap and its head is up. And so it's still in there, but he's hidden it between. Still life is always important to him. And it's kind of becomes part of the piece. And then the women paintings at the same time.
We should say, just subject matter wise, right? When Picasso and Chagall tackled that subject, they're thinking about romantic love and the marriage union, and it goes without saying, I think, heterosexual coupling. And so for Paul to take this on, you start wondering, like, well, is he upending this narrative?
I mean, she doesn't look very happy.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, to me, it looks like a Pietà, where it's like Christ laying across.
Yeah.
So
probably is there too.
But that's the Crocker painting, on the left there. Beautiful painting.
The backstory on at least three of them is that Paul somehow lost interest in them and gave them to an artist named Roland Peterson, who's very well known, still around, and said, you might want to use these for the stretcher bars. And Roland thought they were too good to do that and kept them, and then eventually gave one to SF MoMA, one to the De Young, and one to the Crocker. And so that's the only reason they're still around.
Yeah, I had, before Scott and I had really talked about the subject, and I had started writing a little amateur art essay about these paintings.
It's good. I footnoted it.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
But Francis Mill put me in touch with Roland Peterson, and I called Roland, and I said, it just seemed like a coincidence that he had donated. At the time, I only knew two of the paintings. Mm-hmm. Turned out there was a third to the SF MoMA.
Do we know what all 8 of them look like? Do they all still exist?
No, they probably do, but we don't. We know about 4 or 5 of them. Yeah. But Roland, I said, how did you get these? Is there a reason why you were attracted to this subject matter? And he told a story about, no, Paul gave them to him for the stretcher bars. Yeah.
I wanted you to talk a bit about, Bill and Paul really do figuration differently from Diebenkorn, and particularly in subject matter. There's more landscape, they're kind of more outdoors. I think of Bischoff, and there's a lot of indoor scenes and so forth, but I think of them as being kind of more outdoors. Is my perception wrong, or do you think that that's kind of true between?
I don't know how to answer that. I'm not sure, Scott.
Paul did at this time do a lot of outdoor scenes, and Diebenkorn tends to like to have people in a room with a window, so there's still an outdoor scene, but you're still outdoor. Mm-hmm. But this
next one is an indoor, obviously.
Yeah.
But I still think that, and this as well. But I still think of them being more outdoors than they were. I think in part maybe because they were in Davis and they were spending more time.
I think, the Davis period was kind of pivotal for them.
Yeah.
It was very small, and they also got them away from everybody else. So they were kind of on their own, and UC Davis would soon become a very hotbed of talent. Was one of the best art schools in the country, but at this time it wasn't quite yet.
No, that would be about 5 years later, I think. Yeah. So, and then switching back, there's one more. This is another interior. But they moved down to Los Angeles for a bit in the early 60s, right?
Yes, Santa Monica and then and Malibu.
Mm-hmm. And then this is another really kind of great quote about Bill. It is easy to identify William Theo Brown as a Western California artist. His paintings appear to have grown out of doors like plants, and there's a freedom of form and color that seems like Western scenery, to know no boundaries. And the human figure takes its place as a natural part of the landscape, unseparated from it. Man is not portrayed against a physical world that serves him as a mere background. He is an integral part of that world, which was written by William Ing, who was a playwright in 1967. So turning to Theophilus, and you wanted to talk a bit about kind of their swimming pool series and so forth. Let me get to these.
So he's moved away from his football. He's still kind of doing athletes. And by the way, all his friends are like, "Thank God, no more football paintings." He's made it more universal. It's diving, it's swimming, occasionally wrestling. This one is called Muscatine Diver, and it's because when he lived in Moline, his class would get on a riverboat and they'd go down to Muscatine, and the landscape of this painting reminded him of Muscatine. I asked him, "Are these both men?" And he said, "Yes, they're both meant to be men. But one was invented and one was done from a photograph."
So, and then we have
And then the swimming pool paintings. And I didn't really put this all together until after the book was done, which sort of makes me mad, but I did put it on a label in the show, is that in late 63, a very well-known artist named David Hockney came to and met them. And both he and Paul are doing swimming pool paintings. David Hockney then goes to LA and the next year starts to do swimming pool paintings. And I don't know that it's important to say who did it first, but I do know who gets a lot of credit for the swimming pool paintings, and that's David Hockney. But if you look at Paul's circa 1962, and then this is the first swimming pool 1964 painting, I think that it's hard to imagine they didn't have this discussion or at least lay eyes on these paintings that came later.
Yeah. And then this is Bill's version of it. And now going through the 60s, they paint in the figurative style through most of the 60s, at least the first half, maybe a little bit more. And then they start looking around for kind of different ways of working. And I came across this quote in your slide deck. Thank you for including it. The conventions of governing the division of space in Paul Wanner's still lifes are basically the conventions of abstract art, hard edge division. Yet he has so persuasively insinuated his repertory of beautifully observed objects into this space, this abstract space, that he succeeds in converting it into another kind of pictorial experience. Without entirely breaking with the modernist past, he has found a fresh function for some of his practices. The result strikes me as a particularly fine painting, which was written by Hilton Kramer in the New York Times in 1979. So with Paul, he starts working towards still life. And this is one of the kind of the early kind of series, very minimal still lifes that he does.
Yeah, and you would think that these minimal still lifes go into the very busy still lifes that he does later, but they don't. There's this whole period of surrealism between the two. But if you think about these in the 1960s and other artists like Wayne Thiebaud and Joe Good and all these artists that are doing very simple subjects in a big expanse, he's very much part of that. Mm-hmm. I can't take credit for this whole pansy thing. This is a Crocker painting. I never thought about it, but now I can't see it any other way. This little pair of pansies, it's like a little self-portrait of he and Bill. And if you look at the bottom, this is your Webster's Dictionary. Offensive came out a term of abuse and disparagement. And if you start to look at Paul's paintings, there are pansies in a lot of them. And I think it's his own little, he would hide things in, even the way he signed things, he'd hide his signature and little pieces of paper stuck in things. So that's what I see it now. But it's still a beautiful painting, just as a beautiful painting.
So now that we can, moving forward a little bit in time, because we head up to about the mid 70s, and then Paul really starts getting into this, which is
And
completely
this is when
different.
he totally found his voice all over again. And there was some soul searching in between, but he started to look at 17th century Dutch still lifes and really bring it up to speed with contemporary times. And he did not lay out this still life and then paint it. He painted each object individually and fit it in. He would do it like a drawing of the whole thing just to see. He says it's easy to paint like a coffee cup or a whatever, but it's hard to make the whole painting work. And so if you follow it, he described it as reading like a Gothic painting. Take the spoon, takes you up to the plant, which pushes you over to the drink, which takes you to the brush, which pulls you around. So it creates this centrifugal motion that's holding the structure of the painting together. And at the same time, he's got things that he likes, things that he finds beautiful, package design, which he'd done for 5 years in New York. And it's just wonderful. And people almost universally loved it. All the critics loved it except one named Alan Temko, who wrote some really mean things.
Yes,
I
he
did have to go back and punch him in the teeth. But because Paul even said it really, people stopped talking to me after that review. It was really very mean. But everybody else seemed to love them. Peaceable Kingdom, which is a great one.
Can I just say, in talking to Paul, when he would talk about moving away from that Bay Area figurative style to this, he used the terminology that I think he didn't say frustrated, but that he I think was frustrated by this idea that people they couldn't see what he was trying to depict. The looseness of the Bay Area figurative style, even though we see a figure in it, we don't always know the specific details of what the figure's handling or what the context is. And he used the phrase that he wanted to talk about, the things that he wanted to talk about, he wasn't getting to do, he wasn't able to share them the same way. And so these were the paintings that he felt he was able to talk about the things he wanted to talk about. And if you think about it, the language that you would expect an artist to use would be more like that he wanted to render or he wanted to depict. But to use this idea that, it's almost like painting is a language, he's basically saying, I wanted to talk about and share these things that he found moving. And I think that he could find beauty and equilibrium in, and that's what he wanted to share with people.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I find interesting about them is that they arrive in the mid 70s, right at a moment when conceptualism has kind of reached its apogee and is kind of losing its role as kind of the leading edge of art. And there's no definitive successor for that in the story of modernist kind of marching forward progressive painting into a new idea. And so realism kind of reemerges as the new realism, as kind of a new thing that we can celebrate again. And Paul wasn't thinking about this in any sort of terms like that, but they just kind of land right at that moment in kind of the way that art in America is happening. And there was a great, I think probably there more than just Alan's, review. There were people who were quite shocked by this whole thing because you're going all the way back to the beginning of modernism.
But Paul said, fortunately, for the first time in my life, I was in the right place at the right time. This is a fun painting because that little note at the bottom, the painting is owned by a gentleman named Kevin Carney, who's also an artist. And Kevin had asked if he would paint a little postcard with one of Kevin's paintings in one of his paintings. And Paul instead writes this little note, says, "Dear Kevin, I'm sorry I couldn't make your painting work. It just didn't fit in the composition." So that's what the note says. The note still exists, by the way. Yeah.
Does he still have the note?
He still has the note. Yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
I hope it goes with the painting.
It does. Yeah.
Scott, I wanted to respond to your reference to the way the still lifes were received, because while I think you know, in the book, you shared what many of the critics said, and I thought the reviews were really super strong and really very insightful. But I get the sense that there were people that wanted Paul to keep painting in that Bay Area figurative way. There's almost like a disappointment when an artist ends up going in another direction. And did you have a sense that that had happened?
I didn't, only because between the Bay Area figuration and this, there was all these things that happened in between. They're very simple still lifes, the minimal ones. Then he went through several years, 3 or 4 years of kind of surrealism and little works on paper that often have biblical references, literary references. He was really mythology, and really was kind of struggling to re-find his voice. So I feel like there might have been some people that were shocked, but I think most of them were just happy he was not doing those surrealist paintings anymore.
So, I mean, he paints these for many, many decades after this. But then kind of closer to the end of his life, he starts getting into a whole series of works of him depicting himself in his studio with models. And then this one in particular, the next is from a series he called Youth and Old Age. Yeah.
Oh, he says they're both me in a way. He says it's the art that connects us. But Bill then chimes in. He says he also put himself in there because he wanted to be remembered, which I think is sweet.
Yeah. So dialing back in the timeline again to go back to kind of where we left off with Bill and figuration. Oh, and actually, before we do that, I just wanted to point out that Paul also has this whole series of paintings at near the end that are very much influenced by French painting from the 19th century. This one is very close to Edouard Manet's painting here of Luncheon on the Grass. But he also has a great love of Cézanne.
Yeah, he really rediscovered Cézanne.
Yeah.
And there are lots and lots of these too. It's not just a one-off. There are many of them.
Yeah. Which I thought was interesting because they get very kind of loose and kind of head back towards a figurative style in a way.
Right.
And in a way mimic the way that Cézanne was getting very loose towards the end of his life in the way that his work was painted, at least in the sense of abstraction. They're not tight anymore.
Paul said, I was getting a little sick of still life painting.
It had only been 25 years. I don't know what was the problem. So, but going back, Theophilus' painting really changed in the mid 60s. Like the brushiness, the looseness of it really.
They both got a lot tighter, and the loose brushwork kind of disappeared for both of them.
Mm-hmm. So we kind of start going into these.
But the architecture in these comes out of his trip in 1966. He went to Italy specifically to look at works by Giorgio de Chirico. And so de Chirico is all about the architecture, and all of a sudden architecture starts where it had been grass and ponds before. Now we've got buildings, and the buildings become more and more pronounced later in his work too.
Yeah. And then we have this still working in the landscape, which he does very much to the end of his life. But in about 1970, late 60s, early 70s, he starts this whole series of portrait paintings, and that's a real focus for him in the rest of his career.
They're portraits, but maybe we'd call them figure paintings because he didn't really do portraits. He wouldn't really do portraits. Once he did people, his friends, people that interested him, that sort of thing. But
and then this is another one as well. Do we know who any of these? I mean, do we know more about these models?
We do some of them, yeah. Yeah, he's still around, still making art, right? Yeah, he's a good artist.
But do we know anything about Jim Christensen at all? Or
I don't remember. I did know something about him, but I forgot.
And then this is, an image of them. The whole drawing group thing starts in the 70s.
And so that's, there's Wayne Thiebaud, Mark Adams, Beth Van Hosen, Gordon Cook, and Theophilus Brown get together and draw once a week. And they're very religious about it for more than a decade, I believe, and made thousands and thousands of drawings together.
Yeah. This is one that we have upstairs of Sean.
Lovely one.
Yeah. And this one too of David M. And we were fortunate to find like the original photograph of this sitter. So we actually, it's very, very faithful to him, which is kind of interesting. Yeah.
I just thought it was interesting because the medium, you know, the juiciness and the brushwork of oil is really different. If you look at the past 7 or 8 of these, everything's in acrylic.
Right.
And that is a whole different feel, and that's a little more tightening, because, you know.
Mm-hmm.
He talked about having to layer and layer acrylic because he said, I wasn't trying to make an oil, but I wanted a certain richness that you can get with oils that you can't get with acrylics. They both kind of developed a sensitivity to oil paint, and that's why they gave it up. And also, for a while, they had in their basement, when they moved to Noe Street, their garage was their studio, and it was not very well ventilated. And so that really sort of cemented their...
Yeah. And this is another one that is really great. But he also focuses on the male nude, particularly in the nude male form. And do you think that that choice actually kind of hindered his career a bit, just because they're not as widely desired, say, as a female nude? Or
His dealers would tell him, don't bring us male nudes because we can't sell them. But he also, though, points out, he says, I gave pretty much equal time to both sexes. I didn't really just focus, but because that seems to be the way people want to perceive me, you know, that they get more focus, but if you look at the numbers, they're not really overwhelmingly more men than women.
But perhaps in relation to, say, some of the other artists, there's a lot more men, and so it became more apparent for a lot of people.
Yeah, compared to other members of his circle, for sure.
Yeah, this is another great piece, which you have up at the museum.
We have. They made this. They made this into like 20 by 30 feet and put it on the side of the Laguna Art Museum when the show was down there, which was kind of fun to drive down the street and see this. I thought, good. But then you look and see what people are wearing as they come out of the water. It's like, no wonder they weren't worried.
And then I wanted to, Jamie, I'm forgetting Jamie's last name. Yates, that's it. He was kind of a big part of Bill and Paul's life, starting in the early 1990s and basically till their deaths.
He had, here's what I know, and then maybe you can, I mean, he was interested in Paul first. He wrote him a fan letter, essentially, and said, I really think you're a great artist. And then he and Paul became friends. But then he ended up becoming better friends with Bill and lived in the studio and served as a model many, many times. But what?
I mean, I didn't know. We went on a road trip, Jamie, Bill, and I. But he, you know, he had a lot of addiction problems and behaved as many addicts do. So it was really an up and down and extremely painful relationship. And it may have evolved differently this time, but I would get pretty impatient with Jamie. You know,
Yeah.
I had nothing against Jamie personally. I liked him. It was one of those strange things where I couldn't quite perceive what the charm was, you know, he seemed fine, but you know.
Well, he's very good looking. That's probably, I mean, that's probably the main thing.
Good looking, but so were a lot of other people. But he had some hold over Bill and you know, was maybe not the most wonderful influence, but what can you say? He did, great art came out of it, so. What were you gonna say?
I 100% agree. I remember him being at an opening here in 99, maybe 2000, and including one of the pieces you have upstairs of him that was on the cover of the catalog. And there were a lot of other lookers that Bill had around him that, you know, were more, you know, less problematic and more, you know, easy on the eyes even. So I think there was, to say something nice, I would say, I think there was some real charm or connection that he had that wasn't just aesthetic. And then Bill definitely kind of shipped him off when he needed to in order to be able to kind of live his life and stayed in contact forever and sort of found ways to support him in doing what he needed to do, but keeping him at a distance so that he could not, be wound up in those problems. And so he cared about him deeply, but knew that he couldn't have him day to day in his life.
Just one more and then questions, right?
Yes.
Okay. I don't want to keep people too long.
No. We're all, but I did. And then around 2000 when the big shift happens and he starts making the collages.
I think 2001, I
Yeah.
think is the official time.
And these are completely abstract and very different from anything. So how did he get into making that work, Matt?
Well, what I understand, and Scott, correct me if your knowledge is different, but he worked with a peel-away palette, and one day he sort of had taken a piece of it, or somehow part of the paint came off of it, and he liked what he saw. He liked the kind of abstract elements. It was very non-objective. And I think he kept the piece around for a while, and then later decided to engage and start playing around with these shapes and reconfiguring them. And sometimes he would cut, sometimes he would rip, sometimes he would add paint. And in some instances, I've seen completed works that were actually, they're not collages, they're just a straight painting. I noticed watching him work in the studio that, partly being his age, I mean, he was lived into his early 90s. He didn't have the same, facility with his fingers, his hands. And I think that may have also contributed to why working in this medium worked for him. He was able, it wasn't fine drawing. It was moving these shapes around. And, he started, I think, making them relatively small and ultimately made some large ones, really quite beautiful. And, here you see, I think, the element of a comb that he got from a friend whose, I think, son had left the comb in her apartment or something. And he saw it and he realized he could use that in the art and borrowed it.
Well, with that, I think we've just about kind of covered most of their careers in a very short period. Do we have any questions at all for the two panelists?
I have one question.
Yes.
Just from all of how well you know both of them, but one of them studied with Leger, and I was trying to sort of find Leger's effect upon him. I don't know if there's any specific piece you can think of that maybe it comes through.
I don't think there was much effect. In fact, when I did a bigger version of this talk, I showed Leger and I showed him at the same time, and there's very little influence that I could trace to that. But he was also not very impressed with that whole course of study and didn't last very long. It was only a couple of months. So yeah, he kind of moved on quickly.
I'll just add one thing. I'm always really curious about how art movements happen and how whether a particular movement doesn't happen in a particular place, whether or not it would have emerged elsewhere and things like that. One thing about the famous contemporary Bay Area show in Oakland that Paul Mills put together in 1957 is learning, I saw John Seed's film about it that he posted on YouTube recently, and I didn't know that, and you write about this as well, that the lineup changed, that Mills had, I think, 14 artists originally planned for the show. It did not include Bill Brown, but he delayed the show a few months, 3 months, because he was looking to get some, I don't know if it was a review or some attention to the show, and so he wanted to delay it once he'd arranged that. And by the time it happened, Bill was now included, and there were only 12 artists in the show. But you start reflecting on how the course of a life could really change if you're not in this particular moment.
I think there were 3 women in the original lineup too, and in the end, there were no women included in that show.
Yeah.
A couple of them chose not to be it.
Yeah, right.
Personally, we're not a part of this. No.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and Scott writes about it, and John Seed talks about how Diebenkorn in particular,
Didn't like it.
I forget the words he used, but he was really concerned about the idea of being put into the school category.
Also because he was going to be late. He says Diebenkorn said David Park was all for it because he was going to be the granddaddy of it all. And me, I was very nervous about this idea, and he said that he was very vocal about this should not happen. And part of the reason the term Bay Area figurative happened was because they thought it didn't sound like a movement. And that seemed to work better for them because none of them wanted to be affiliated with a movement other than maybe David Park.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for putting this together.
Thank you.
Thank you.